Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, I have the pleasure of being joined by the incredible Mr. X Dreams. I hope you're ready, because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I love to choose my outfits, but they tend to be skin tight, or you see some skin. Anyway, I was walking home from school one day, and I was wearing a skirt with shorts underneath, as well as stockings and a shirt. While walking home, I was listening to music on high, trying to block out the world for a long day at school. I felt something brush up against me and didn't think anything of it. I was a bit entertained in my music and could have even been humming, and I noticed something brush up against me. So I glanced behind me and see a man about 2 inches close to me. I screamed in surprise and apologized to him for screaming because he seemed pretty flustered himself. He walked in front of me and sped away. I couldn't tell, but I think he was trying to look up my skirt. That would explain the weird feeling of wind while he was behind me. If that wasn't strange enough, it took me a while to finally get home. I stopped off and took some breaks to try and calm down. When I finally got home, I noticed someone that I hadn't seen around my apartment. I thought I might have a new neighbor because there was a guy under my stairway. He just looked like some kid who went to my high school. He was wearing a hoodie and basketball shorts. When I came up to my apartment, he moved directly underneath my staircase, which has holes in it, so you can look up and see the person through the stairs. I can notice this guy was definitely trying to look up my skirt. I had a pretty smug look on my face because I'd worn shorts. And when I'd gotten to the top of my stairs, I noticed he pulled out his phone and was trying to take pictures. I was feeling extremely scared at this point. I had forgotten all about the guy from before and couldn't seem to unlock my door. My front door has an electric phone lock, and my phone had not been able to connect to the location for some reason. I realized I couldn't get into my own house, and there was some creepy perv trying to take pictures of me right under the stairs. I looked under the stairs to see if he was still there, and he most assuredly was. Not only was he there, but he was also jacking off right underneath the stairs. He had all his equipment out and was just doing it there and then. I just about had a heart attack. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't run down the stairs and leave because he was right there, and I couldn't go into my house because it was locked and I couldn't connect to it. I decided to call my dad and ask him what to do. My dad called the police, which for me is probably what I should have done in the first place, but I had no time to think. I'd sat out of eyesight and yelled at the perv to leave, but I didn't know if he was aggressive or if he would respond. I decided to just make a run for the community offices at our apartment complex, and I made a plan to find a phone there and find people so he couldn't harass me if he got the chance. I made the choice and started running down the stairs into the office, and I looked back and he wasn't there. Relieved but still full of adrenaline, I ran to my house, and my dad had finally unlocked it. Later, the police came by and asked me some questions, and they said they'd keep an eye out, but they never found him. I haven't seen him since, and hope that it stays that way.
This is a true story that happened when I was a little girl. I grew up in the small city of Des Moines, Iowa back in the 1980s. It felt pretty safe. Me and my brothers and sisters would play outside alone and go down the street to a neighbor's house without any worries that it might be unsafe. My mom was very protective, yet she let us play around the neighborhood without her, as long as we stuck together. But deep down, we all knew there were creeps out there in our seemingly safe town. Just a few years back, 2 paper boys went missing. Johnny Gosh and Eugene Martin. One of our neighbors down the road was Eugene's dad. He had moved to our street after Eugene had gone missing. Although we'd ride our bikes past his house, he never smiled. He always seemed very sad, and he never found out what happened to his son. One incident occurred there that I will never forget. It's made me very protective of my own young son, whom I would never let play outside alone, and I constantly remind him about stranger danger. I was the youngest child in my family at the time this incident happened. My grandfather had passed away a few years before, and my mom inherited his beat-up old truck. She didn't drive it too often because it normally wouldn't fit all of us in it. But she was driving it one day when she picked me up from school. It was just the 2 of us because I only attended half-day kindergarten. We were on our way home and were probably only a few miles away from the house. We were driving on a very busy road, and I was starting to doze off because it was a warm summer day and there was no air conditioning in the truck. I was hot and sleepy. Suddenly I was startled awake by my mom shouting, "Oh no, something's wrong with the truck." She was panicked and started to change lanes in order to pull over. Smoke and flames started pouring out from under the hood. The smell was awful, and I began coughing as the smoke was making its way inside the truck. My mom stopped on the shoulder, came around to my side and opened my door, picking me up. She ran with me far from the truck so she could get away from the horrible smoke and flames. She held me tight and seemed unsure what to do. Here she was on the side of the road with a little girl and no way to call for help. It was the 80s. No cell phones. She seemed really freaked out and wasn't sure if we should wait for help or start walking. She just knew it wasn't safe for us to remain there, especially in the heat with the cars speeding by just feet from us. That's when all of a sudden a little blue car pulled over and stopped right beside us. It was a 2-door, and now, as a 35-year-old adult, I know it was a Pontiac Acadian. A heavy-set, balding, older man leaned over and opened his passenger door to talk to us. He said, "Looks like you 2 are in some trouble. Can I give you a ride somewhere?" My mom was holding me tightly in her arms. I was born premature and was extremely small for my age. I could tell she was scared and really not sure what to do. She didn't want to stay on the side of the road, and she really needed to call someone about the truck. She hesitated, but she decided to let him give us a ride home, since it wasn't too far. She seemed really nervous because my mom is a very cautious person. She didn't trust easily and always warned us about strangers and never to accept rides from strangers. But we were so close to home. Surely this one time it would be okay. So we got into the front passenger seat. Back then, no one seemed to worry much if a kid rode in the front seat in her parents' lap, and he started driving. Even though I was so young, I noticed his car was really dirty. Inside there were tin cans and jars all over the place, filled with various collections. One can was full of screws, a Planters peanut jar full of nails. It was odd. I went to point this out to my mom, and she immediately told me to be quiet and pushed my head down against her chest, like she was going to rock me to sleep. I didn't know if that was just her way of trying to keep me quiet, or if she was doing it to protect me. My head was sideways as I peeked out to look at the guy. His t-shirt was ratty and had holes in it. When I looked up at his face, he glanced at me and gave me a big smile. I closed my eyes quickly, pretending to be asleep. I don't know if I was scared or if I felt uncomfortable being caught staring at him. I just didn't want him to look at me with that creepy smile anymore. It was more sinister than friendly. I felt that even as a young child. I heard my mom give him some directions, and then he said to her, "She would make a good playmate for my son." My mom was surprised by this. He was an older man, and she didn't expect him to have young children. She was clearly a little relieved by the small talk because it made him seem less threatening. She replied, "Oh, how old is your son?" 23. My mom suddenly went rigid and held me much tighter. I squirmed because I was uncomfortable, and she fiercely whispered into my ear, "Don't move, We're almost home. Don't move." I was confused by the sudden change. It didn't occur to me what he had just said. I guess I was too little to understand. However, I was aware that something was very, very wrong. I heard my mom tell him that our house was right up there, and he could let us out. Suddenly, the car stops and my mom lets go of me with one arm in order to open the passenger door. And that's when he grabbed me. He grabbed a hold of my upper arm and said in a menacing tone, "I think I'll keep her." My mom screamed. She had a hold of my other arm and was desperately trying to pull me out of his grasp and out of the open car door. It was like a sick game of tug of war. My shoulders started burning and I felt like my arms were going to be ripped off. And the whole time he was laughing while my mom was screaming. All of a sudden, he either let go because we were making so much noise or he just lost his grip on me. I flew out the door, slamming into my mother. We fell onto the grass curb and the blue car sped away. My mom scrambled to her feet and ran with me in her arms to our front door. She unlocked the door and slammed it closed once we were inside, relocking it. She set me down while she frantically dialed 911 on our rotary phone in the kitchen. I vaguely remember the police being there. They asked a few questions, and I told them that my shoulders hurt. They checked me out and they were really sweet, telling me how strong and brave I was. My mom was so scared and paranoid, not just because he had tried to take me, but that he knew where we lived. She held me so tight that night and kept saying, "I almost lost you. I was so stupid to get in his car. I almost lost you today." And she was much more protective of all of us after that. We never found out who the guy was. I wonder if his son wasn't some other child he'd once abducted. I certainly hope not, but we'll never know.
A few years ago, I was married. We had this skinny neighbor who had a porn stash, thick glasses, and lived directly across the street from us. Our front door faced his, and our garages faced the road at a 90-degree angle to our doors. My wife used to go out onto the front steps and sit and smoke, and one day she was sitting out there smoking and playing her Game Boy when she catches movement out of the corner of her eye. She looks up at my neighbor's house, and something had moved and freaked her out, but she wasn't sure what it was. Her eyes are scouring the front of the house, and she realizes what scared her. She freaked out and came inside. I asked what's wrong, and she points through the window at a concrete block sitting in the neighbor's driveway. It was one of those blocks with 2 holes in it, about 8 or 10 inches wide by 8 or 10 inches wide, and a foot and 18 inches long. She says the neighbor had been laying inside his garage with his head behind the concrete block, watching her through the hole. I was thinking she was overreacting. She had a habit of misinterpreting what she saw or encountered. A week later, she's seated on the steps, and I look outside to see if she's out there or if she'd gone to the store. I see her out there through the blinds, and I look over at the concrete block. No neighbor. I smile to myself, but then I see a glint of light from his bedroom window. I focus in on it, and I swear I can see what looks like a camera lens. I made an excuse for her to come inside. I'm a little creeped out, but I'm not sure what I was seeing. I surprised her the next week by planting hedges between our house and his. A few weeks go by, and all is good. We're more comfortable because he can't see us from his window or door while we're on the front steps. My nephew and nieces swing by one Saturday, and they want to play hide and seek. I'm big, so doubted they'd expect me to climb a tree. So I'm hiding in a tree in the backyard, and I hear them running around and laughing. From up the tree, I can see over the hedge. And who do you think I found standing there jerking off? Yep, neighbor. I quietly climb down the tree and creep up on the hedge. I get to the edge of the shrub and can hear him quietly stroking it. I look over at my house and my niece and my wife are on the front porch playing on their GameCube. I run down to the other end of the hedge and come around it first, just in time to hear his front door close. My wife is demanding to know what just happened, and I send my niece inside to tell her. She's freaked and grossed out by what I said. I have no proof other than I saw him, and I was going to throw him a beating, not the good time, but my wife stopped me. 4 months later, we were in our living room playing Monopoly with my sister. They're all tipsy, and my sister wants to get a picture of us. She sits her fat butt on the couch between us and snaps a selfie of the 4 of us. She snaps a couple more, and all of a sudden our satellite goes, and there's a sound outside the window behind us, like someone tripping over patio furniture. I turn on the outside light and find 2 patio chairs tipped over, and one of them had snagged our satellite cable and pulled it apart. While I'm out there, I see a face and fingerprints on the glass right behind where we'd been sitting. I borrow my sister's camera and look at the pictures that she'd snapped. The first picture she snapped showed the bridge of nose and thick glasses and 2 very surprised brown eyes wide open. I wanted to kill the man. Again, my wife stopped me. The next day I go over there with pictures that my sister had taken and tell him he had weeks to move or else, and I punched a hole in his front door for good measure. It took him a month, but he moved out. It was a very creepy time.
Number 1. Malaysia, September 2012. I like to call this story the Night of the Were-Crabs. I got in the habit of naming my stories as I think it can be quite fun. I was working as an English teacher in Wuxi, China. If you've never heard of it, that's okay. It's a little out-of-the-way town just outside of Shanghai. You know, population of around 5 or 6 million people. Easy to miss. China exists on a different scale, at least from what I'm used to, being from the frontier territory that is Midwestern Canada. I had a 1-year stint there. It was a very mixed experience, which I could go on about at great length. The only thing pertinent to this story is that I met my traveling buddy there. Let's call him M. He was from Florida, apparently a very attractive guy, as he was the one that was always getting hit on by both sexes. He's gay and I'm straight. But suffice it to say that he was still the one who got all the attention. He is also one of those human beings who makes you proud to be a human being. He was someone you couldn't help but like. I actually did not directly work with him, and we knew very little about one another, as he worked at a different school than I did. But I could tell right away that we would get on well, and I was right. We both felt this sense of existential angst, a longing for going on a walkabout, as the Aussies like to say. I had Aussie coworkers at the time who just told me about the concept, so I have confidence using the term here, and so, on a walkabout we went. We had a deal with one another. He really wanted to spend a night in the jungles of Sumatra, an idea I wasn't particularly fond of, but that's a whole other story. It really is, but it will have to wait for another time. In return, I would get to choose a place. Whenever I meet a fellow traveler, I like to ask them 2 questions. What do you live for? And where's the best place you've ever been? In a hostel in Hanoi, I met a lady from Switzerland who had sold all of her possessions and was taking a very literal world tour. It was she who told me about Palau Kapas. We had spent a couple of weeks in Malaysia, but primarily in the more urban places like Kuala Lumpur, or KL as the locals like to say. Again, a little capital of close to 2 million people. So thus far in our trip, we were living with all the Western comforts. Palau Kapas was on the eastern side of Malaysia in a less populated area. This part of the trip started off with an unsettling vibe. After taking our pictures where we positioned ourselves to make it look like a statue of Ronald McDonald was giving us a spanking, we went to the main bus stop, which was a little bit sketchy. It was late, and we were somewhat confused as to which bus to take. Our friend helped us find our correct bus stop, and we set up shop as we had to wait a few hours for the bus to arrive. The concierge, emphasis on the con, asked us for our tickets, and then asked us to pay again as the payment did not go through. I've had various careers as a teacher, security guard, taxicab dispatcher, and a door-to-door salesman. Messing with people is part of my bread and butter. However, I like to think that I use my skills for good. One thing I cannot abide is someone who has the gift of the gab, as my mother likes to say, and uses it as a weapon to swindle people. I remember him giving me this really sketchy smile. Honest to God, it reminded me of Professor Ratigan from The Great Mouse Detective. I like to do what I call my Columbo routine. Act innocent and oblivious of the malicious intent of the other person, and go along with the logical consequences of their ruse. "Oh, okay," I said. "Well, let's go see your boss. I'm sure he could sort it out." The man refused, saying that that was unnecessary. I insisted that we needed to make sure, for both our sakes. After all, we wouldn't want a mistake on their end either. And what do you know, the matter was dropped. So the bus arrives. It's a big double-decker with fancy reclining, heated, and vibrating seats, which apparently is beyond the technical capabilities of my native country of Canada. We ascend the stairs in excitement, partially over the trip, and partially over the fact that we finally get to sit down. But yet another problem occurs. I'm pretty sure I know the English alphabet and Arabic numerals, and yet our seats do not match our tickets. We were told we had seats at the top front of the bus, and here we are midway in the aisle. Professor Ratigan insists that these are our seats, and of course I beg to differ. I go to the manager. The manager storms out, furious and on my side. My past has also made me a very diplomatic person. I never yell or get angry at staff because I've been there. My rule of thumb is, treat people like people, but also make strong allies. And always remember, shit rolls downhill. The swindler pretended it was just a big misunderstanding and we left it at that. No, this did not turn into one of those stalker stories where the guy tracked me down on the island and a horrific Rambo-esque game of cat and mouse ensued, though that would be a pretty great movie. Rather, he perhaps learned some humility, but probably just kept on being an asshole. Meanwhile, I just went to a really cool island. I want to point out that I'm not one of those complainer-type people, as I make it a point not to be. It comes very naturally because I'll pretty much put up with a lot, as long as I don't think it's because someone is doing it to me out of malice. I will suffer through hell rather than bother staff or send back food. Case in point, we had no idea how to turn the damned AC off in our section of the bus. We put our jackets over top of them and balanced our feet on top to stop the air getting out, rather than complain. Getting to the island wasn't very much fun. The bus trip was overnight, traveling the coast, and we were dropped off at about 4 in the morning on the side of the road, in what seemed to be like the middle of nowhere. We hadn't slept at all, and I mean not at all. As a chronic insomniac, this is not totally unusual, but it is annoying. The bus stop was less of a bus stop and more of a place that the bus stopped. It felt like a range road or an alleyway. We didn't even realize we were in a town until we started to walk around. It was quite a contrast to what we were used to. We eventually realized that we were dropped off at the correct place, at a bus stop outside of a sleepy town which was just hard to discern in the dead of night. Then things started to get surreal. Some David Lynch on acid type stuff. We started to hear odd religious chanting through loudspeakers, which totally took us aback. Malaysia is a largely Muslim country, and apparently morning prayers start very early and are very public. The language was beautiful but also haunting. Keep in mind that we are both from North America. I believe that we've never experienced Muslim morning prayers before, or if we did, we slept through them. We certainly had never experienced them while being severely sleep-deprived. We tried sleeping in a park to no avail. We tried sleeping on a bench, and then on the damp ground. I'm hard-pressed to pick which one was worse. Then we decided to head down to the pier, where M did actually manage to get a bit of sleep, literally sleeping on what was basically just a cement slab, but somehow he looked comfortable. I wanted to strangle the life out of his body. Of course I'm kidding. I guess I was not only envious, but confused as hell as to how anyone could look so damn content sleeping on cement. M was not happy despite his 40-minute nap. He was reluctant to go in the first place, and things had been uncomfortable so far. But when we saw the island, his reservations were quelled and my expectations exceeded. We stayed at a hostel called the Captain's Longhouse. It's an amazing place, by the way, but keep that under your hat. The beaches are like something out of a film. Perfect white sand and clear bluish-green water. There were few people there, and you could find yourself entirely alone on a secluded beach, which is amazing unless you step on a sea urchin while swimming. The limping to the nearest hostel or resort was not fun. I will full-on admit I acted like I almost lost a limb. However, the locals were amazingly friendly. They offered to help. They told me never to try to pull out the barb as it just causes more damage. They brought a machete up to me and pretended like they were going to amputate my leg. My family loves practical jokes, so I knew where they were going with that. They just whacked at my wound with the handle. It crushes up the stinger, and I was good to go. Anyway, this is a fairly isolated place. There are a few resorty type things, but they are small. Typhoon season was just beginning as well. Everyone was putting out sandbags. We probably would have stayed there for months if not for that. We asked foreigners who lived there why they stayed on the island. Their answer? Why would we ever leave? We saw their point. The island also has an interesting history. There are apparently a lot of shipwrecks off the coast from the old porcelain trade. A crazy amount of Dutch ships and Chinese junks. There are so many, in fact, that there's a local who collects old shards of porcelain from the wrecks and makes them into jewelry. The other thing the island's known for is the fact that the mainlanders used to use the island as a burial ground. It was a sacred site. When I was there, the area where the bodies were supposed to be was fenced off, and it appeared as if construction was going to happen there soon. I don't think they were putting up a resort. I think they were making the place more of an official cemetery. They have a few local ghost stories, of course. The big one, and the only one I remember, was that supposedly there was a ghost of a fellow who liked to hang around the dock. Boats would come in and unload their passengers or goods, and people would see this guy on the dock and talk with him. He didn't seem ghost-like. He would just appear to be a middle-aged local man wearing a leisure suit. He was friendly and just wanted to chat, and then he would disappear. He seemed harmless and people even seemed to like him. I never saw him. My ghost story, though mild, happened one night when my friend and I were the only visitors staying at the Longhouse. The place has a welcoming vibe and looks like a picturesque, Swiss Family Robinson-like construction. There was a large main room, people only being separated by veils. We stayed in one of the private rooms which were located along a wooden walkway which ran around the Longhouse. The individual rooms had a wooden door, but only a veil was used for the most part if I recall correctly. It was really hot and humid, but you had to keep the mosquitoes out. But with every gentle breeze, the veil would wave in a ghost-type fashion. Suffice it to say, this place was awesome, but had a slightly creepy vibe to it. If one's mind were to go in that direction, which I made great efforts to avoid, it would be downright freaky at night. Going to the bathroom entailed circling the wooden walkway, going past a large mirror. I've always had a fear of mirrors. I fear seeing something that's not there or my face not being my face. I had a creepy experience of the latter sort when I was young. However, I should say that I do regard myself as a skeptic and believe it was probably all in my head. One night, me and my buddy sat outside on the beach telling stories. The Longhouse is fairly isolated from the other resorts. Most are a good 15-minute walk down the beach. The nearest one is on the other side of a massive rocky outcrop which separates the two. No one was staying there at the time, and it could have only been reached by going up through the jungle, which would have been pretty freaky on its own. Warning: if you go along a jungle path, do not slide your hand along the guard ropes. Leafcutter ants like to gather in clumps on it, as I found out after picking up a handful of them. I am quite accident-prone. So we were sitting there on this perfect, soundless night. We have the moon for lighting, and nothing else. Oddly enough, we were sitting close to the rocky outcrop which separates the two resorts. I say oddly because this is possibly the dirtiest part of the beach. There wasn't any garbage, but lots of driftwood and seaweed. It's also where the surf is really noticeable. When the tide is down, you can almost walk around the outcrop on the temporary beach. If you did, you would notice a little cave at the base of the ledge. There are a few caves on the island. They're mostly shallow, but still gave me the creeps. So we're sitting there. We honest to God just start talking about ghost stories and it happens. We heard faint singing. It sounded like a young woman's voice. It was kind of hollow and haunting. I know that sounds cliche, but it's true. And the song was coming from that cave. We were freaked, but not so freaked as we ran away. I scare pretty easily, but I was fine just sitting there and listening to the song. We were more curious than anything, thinking, really? This is happening? Well, of course this is happening. We just started talking about ghost stories. Just our luck, I guess. We look at each other perplexed and having difficulty believing it's happening. We tried as best we could, but we couldn't make out any of the words. It lasted for about an hour. I believe it started around 10 at night and went on to about 11. Of course, this sound could have just been wind blowing through the cave, and the tide at some sweet spot which enabled it. But there was no wind. I tried my best to rationalize it, but I really couldn't come up with anything much. Nothing probable anyway. In the morning we mentioned it to the resort caretakers. I actually can't remember what they said, but I do remember them being unfazed. Ghost stories seemed quite normal to them. The only other bizarre thing that happened on the island before that was on the night that we arrived, the night of the were-crabs. We were walking back to the longhouse from a place we ate at which was further down the beach. We ate curry crab almost every night. It was divine. It was a bit of a trek, but we didn't mind. The sand just melted between your toes. It was pleasantly warm and the surf was slowly rising. If you walk along the tidal edge, the sand might give way and you might fall a few feet into soft sand. It was fun, but of course there is little to no artificial illumination on the island. We hadn't even brought a flashlight as it was our first night. We had no idea what to expect and miscalculated big time. We were just following the surf towards the faint glow of the lights at the longhouse. We were almost back at the resort when I kicked something hard. I was carrying my sandals and walking on my bare feet at this time. I knew I had launched whatever it was, but it hurt like a mother. Initially I thought it had to be a rock. It was heavy and hard and hurt like crazy. I was only partially right. It was a were-crab. I launched the guy about 10 feet, kicking him into the dim light of one of the lanterns. He landed on his back and quickly righted himself. We both came to the consensus that we had had quite enough of one another and decided to go our separate ways. I'm sure I surprised and inconvenienced him as much as he did me. I just hope he got more action than I did. We got back to the longhouse. The proprietors were still up and playing cards outside. They had this little lantern above a table. They informed us that this is the night, the only night that this particular species of crabs comes onto land. They were spawning, and they were pissy. Normally crabs, at least in my experience, run away at the sight of a human, but not these guys. These were fighting crabs. They wanted to get their freak on, and nothing, not even giant fleshy human beings, was going to stop them. Seriously, some of these things chased after you. We brought our feet up to our seats for fear of them getting nipped. The dog was going crazy and had some very violent run-ins with the crabs. It sounded like bones cracking, but they both always walked away seemingly unscathed. We finished playing cards and retired to bed. The next morning, the only sign that anything had happened were the angry little crab tracks in the sand and the nasty bruise on my foot. So, creepy man from the bus stop, if we ever meet again, just you remember that I kicked a were-crab and lived to tell the tale.
My only friend Anthony was staying the night at my house. We were just doing the casual things, like playing video games and prank calling. It was around 9 p.m. when my parents came into my room and told us they were going to the grocery store and they would be back in a bit. They said the usual things parents said to their kids when leaving them home alone. Don't answer the door, don't mess around with any guns, blah blah blah. When they left, we just kept playing our games. And about 20 minutes or so later, Anthony says he thought he heard knocking, and I just shake it off to the game making sounds, as it was pretty loud. Not too long after that, we hear knocking from the window in my room. "You heard that one, didn't you?" Anthony says. I knew he wasn't lying now. I paused the game and turned off the TV, but this probably didn't help, as whoever was on the other side probably heard it already. We heard knocking again. This time it was much louder. Anthony thought we should peek through the window, but I told him that it's a stupid idea and not to do it. About a minute later we heard the knocking again, and this time it sounded like it was coming from the back door. "Should we go get the guns?" Anthony says. But right as he said that, we heard the sound of glass smashing in the kitchen. Then we heard something that sounded like shoes stomping on the ground, which was probably the person jumping through the window. Someone was in the house now. We couldn't go get the guns, because my parents' room was right across from mine, and to the left is the living room, which is directly connected to the kitchen. If we tried that, they would see us before we could get them. All we had were a few knives and a machete, but this guy might have a gun. Then we hear slow footsteps going towards the kitchen and the living room. Anthony whispers, "Let's go through the window." This wasn't a bad idea at all, as my window was a bit high off the ground, but not so high where you'd break a limb if you jumped out. At this point, the footsteps sounded like they were in the middle of the living room, and very quietly, I walk up to the window, move the blinds and unlock the window. This made a slight sound, but the intruder didn't seem to hear it. Now my window is very squeaky sometimes, so I tried to open it as quietly as possible, and the footsteps were almost at my room. Midway through opening it, a big squeak sound comes from the window, and we hear the footsteps speed up towards my room. So with all the force I have, I throw the window open as fast as I could, and we hear my door bust open. Anthony practically throws himself out the window, and I'm about to jump, and I get one last glance towards the door, and a tall man in all black is rushing towards me. I tried to jump out, but the man grabbed hold of my foot. I was hanging from the window, and he was trying to pull me back in, but Anthony grabbed my hands and tried to pull me back out. While they were all fighting over me, I kick the man, and somehow his hand slips, and I fall out. I get up as fast as I can, and we go down the hill and onto the road. I look back at my window, and there he was, staring at me. We get a car to stop and beg to use the phone, and they let us. After dialing 911, me and Anthony stayed on the other side of the road. We see police lights in the distance, and I thank the man in the car and he leaves. The cops searched the house, but came out with nothing. The window was busted out, obviously, but no other windows or doors were open, aside from mine. They said he must have gone back through the same window, and while talking to the cops, my parents arrived home, probably confused as hell as to why cops were there, and I explained everything to my mother. Later that night, we checked our outside cameras and the backyard camera, and it caught the man knocking on the back door and the window as he broke it, along the side of the house where the camera shouldn't be. Needless to say, we put up a hell of a lot more cameras, and now we see every angle of the house. As far as I know, my parents aren't planning on leaving me home alone without them, ever again.
On July 6, 1983, at around 3 p.m., I was walking through the parking lot towards my car at Woodland Mall, Grand Rapids, Michigan. I was thinking about my upcoming 25th birthday weekend celebration, and I had just purchased some cute outfits to wear for the weekend. I was oblivious to my surroundings as my mind was on my upcoming plans. As I got closer to the car, I felt the heat radiating off the pavement as the sun was beating down, When I got to the car, I was fumbling through my purse to get my keys and unlock the door. I could smell liquor as I was fumbling for the keys, and then I was hit with this smell of strong, unpleasant body odor. By the time I looked up from my purse, a man was at my side with a knife wearing mirrored pilot-style sunglasses. He told me to get into my car and slide over to the passenger seat. I was so shocked that it was actually happening that I could barely comprehend it. I literally said to him, "What? Are you kidding me?" Before he could answer, I tried handing him my keys and purse, and I told him, "Here you go, there's some cash and a MasterCard in my wallet. Take it, and my Mustang, and leave me here." He pushed his knife against my side and ordered me into the car and to slide over to the passenger seat. I couldn't believe it. I did what he said. He sat in the driver's seat, and I recall seeing the waves of heat radiating off the hood of my car. It was about 90 degrees outside and 110 degrees inside that car. The heat, the smell of liquor and BO was nauseating. The knife was held to my side, and I made a conscious decision that I would not allow one drop of my blood to ooze from my body, and my life would come to a grisly end in this car, in this heat, and the last thing I would smell would be liquor and BO. No way I was going to let that happen. There was no fight or flight options in my circumstances with a knife held at my side in a tiny overheated space. Therefore, something else crept into my mind to preserve my primal will, to live and remain intact. I don't know where the words came from or how I remained so calm to put on an act that saved my life. It was as if another person took over my mouth and mind. I must say that if I was in a daily state of primal fear for my life and could not fight or flee, I would either be the savviest saleswoman ever or an Oscar-winning actress. When the smelly creep exposed himself in front of me, sitting in my car and holding a knife to me, something took over. I started talking. I said, "You're horny, okay, I get it. Listen to me. It's hotter than hell in this car, and if this is going to happen, at least make it happen under better conditions. My apartment's a quarter mile from here. My roommate works second shift, so no one's there. There's AC and ice water, pop and beer in the fridge, so we don't die from dehydration. Now mind you, I didn't have an apartment or a roommate. I was temporarily living with my parents about 20 miles away. That drunken, knife-holding rapist believed the biggest BS story that I to this day don't know where it came from. He asked me for my keys and told me he would drive us there, and after he would make me return him to his car. So I was looking for my keys again and couldn't find them. He got mad and yelled, "Where are they?" And I snapped back, "Hell, I don't know. I probably dropped them when you forced me into the car with a knife." He was feeling around the floor for the keys while still holding the knife against me. I said maybe they fell outside the door. He then told me he was going to open the door and feel around for them, and I'd better not move or he'll stick me with a knife. I told him I'm not risking that happening. I'll just do what he says. He still can't find the keys, and I'm praying he won't find them. He decides to get out of the car and look. When he stepped out, I pulled the door shut and locked it, and began blowing my horn and screaming. He was so angry that he didn't run off. My tilt sunroof was partially open and he stuck his hand with the knife through, trying to stab at my head through the opening. I just kept on the horn and screaming until a couple ran over to my car. The creep then started running, and I got out and screamed. He tried to rape me. The man chased and caught him. Mall security showed up and contacted the police. The creep was arrested and jailed for attempted rape and indecent exposure, etc. I found my keys stuck between the shift column and the passenger seat. I drove home in a shock, still wondering how I came up with that BS story. Through my tears, I started to laugh about the fact that that was my only weapon, the gift of utter bullshit I never knew I had. Seriously though, when one is desperate to survive, they may do or say anything. I took advantage of his weak state of mind and overpowered him mentally. That happened 34 years ago, and to this day I walk through parking lots day or night, fully aware and alert to my surroundings, keys in hand.
The story I'm about to tell you is not mine, but my mother's. The first time she told me that cautionary tale, I was 8 or so, and way too young to process. But in the long run, it sharpened my senses and made me more aware of my surroundings and attentive towards people around me. It was 1982 in Soviet Russia. My mom, Tanya, was 20, studying fashion design and still living with her parents along with the arsehole of an older brother, Peter, in the industrial city of Volsky in South Russia. You see, having a place of your own when you're young and single in Soviet Russia was pretty much unheard of because apartments were scarce as well as being state property. In order to get an apartment, your name was put on a waiting list, where it stayed as long as you remained unmarried, because families came first. In hindsight, being stuck with her family is what spared Tanya from a lifelong trauma. That, and her stamina, which she gained from being a competitive swimmer since childhood. I don't want to exaggerate her prowess though. She wears glasses, stands at 5'4" and weighed about 123 pounds back in the day. So all in all, a physically average young woman. However, the neighborhood she was living in was a quieter and greener area, with only 1-story apartments and 9 parties in each house. A primary and high school in the middle of the block as well, and nice families and hard-working people all around, often 3-generation households, and everyone knew each other since childhood, and everyone felt safe. So did Tanya, when she was heading home after class late one April. After taking the bus, she had to walk 2 or 3 more blocks. She was alone, or so she thought. By 11 p.m. the streets were dead and poorly lit, and they stayed poorly lit for nearly 20 years when I visited my mum's hometown. For some reason, the street lamps there were placed too far apart, so the lit areas didn't merge, and there are plenty of pitch black spaces between them. Tanya's house was in plain view when the scumbag jumped at her from behind the gates of the high school in one of the unlit patches of sidewalk. She didn't hear him coming, and had no hunch that something was up. From her perspective, the attack simply occurred out of the blue, but it's still very likely that he was following her from a safe distance in the dark. All went down very quickly. Hands grabbed her from behind, choking her and covering her mouth, as the bastard tried to drag her off to the sidewalk and behind the school gates, where the view is pretty much blocked, and a passerby wouldn't notice a thing. I'm glad my mom isn't the panicky type. She immediately started to wriggle and kick, and scratched the hand over her mouth. The attacker didn't make a sound as he was trying to push and beat her to the ground, but she resisted because of pure adrenaline. At some point, he tore down her glasses, scratching her badly across the face in the process. Furthermore, he punched her repeatedly in the head and in the neck, just to get her unconscious, I suppose. Oh, it hurt a lot, but only much, much later, my mum said. This asshole was absolutely determined to get his way. He already ripped her blouse to pieces, but my mum never stopped fighting. As soon as she managed to get his hands on her face, she screamed like a banshee. And boy do I know her banshee scream. Lights started popping up in the windows, and Tanya's older brother Peter, who happened to be home for a change, jumped out the window and ran to his sister's screams. That was when the scumbag finally let go. The next morning when she came back in search of her glasses, they were gone. She believes he took them as a souvenir, and a week later she was attending the wedding of her best friend with an aching body and scratches all over her face. Also, she was indulging herself in the luxury of a taxi after the evening classes for a while. What strikes me as odd is that the sicko kept quiet for the duration of the attack. No huffing, no puffing, nor a single howl or scream, even when she started to fight him furiously. I think he simply had to be silent, because she could have recognized his voice. So much for friendly neighbors.
My best friend, Jane, introduced me to a lot of her friends throughout the years, including her boyfriend, Ben, and another guy, Steve. Steve was a few years older than me, but I've always had a habit of attracting slightly older guys. I was 19 or so when I met him. Steve and I kind of hit it off, and we spent a full 12 hours one night just talking about anything and everything while he was drunk. I should explain I have a habit of crushing on pretty much most guys who are nice to me, so of course, I crushed on Steve. We went back and forth. I'd crush on him, but he wouldn't like me. He'd crush on me, but I wouldn't like him. I even dated another guy during all this. Steve and I had kissed, even made out, but that was as far as it ever went. Well, time went on, and eventually my friend Jane and her boyfriend got an apartment with Steve. Steve had been getting increasingly more agitated with people. We knew he had anxiety, but that didn't explain his behavior. He was getting angry, especially with Jane, and mostly over absolutely nothing. This even ruined a group trip we went on with one of our other friends. Now on to the main story. I'd been having a really rough go of it. I just had hand surgery and my grandmother was increasingly suffering from dementia, to the point we had to put her in a nursing home. She'd get angry at my mother and I constantly. I was visiting her one day when I got a phone call from Jane. I excused myself, which caused my grandmother to go off on my mother. Jane was in tears. She was sobbing and panicked and sounded exhausted. She told me she didn't know what to do and hadn't slept in 2 days. She was terrified. She began telling me what happened. Steve was unhinged. He'd spent the entire month high and then suddenly quit, becoming agitated and erratic, even hallucinating. She told me several instances, such as him driving himself somewhere and having to get towed. He had hallucinated that the tow truck driver was stealing his car, and he jumped out of the moving truck to escape. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Jane told me what had happened just the night before. Steve had become so agitated that he flipped a table in the living room and had thrown his laptop against the opposing wall before storming into his room. He'd later been found stabbing himself in the leg with a sword that he owned. Jane was calling while he was in the hospital getting checked out for the sword wound and the cuts from jumping out of the truck. She was afraid to come stay with me because she didn't want to leave Ben alone with Steve, or Steve alone by himself. She continued to say that they were getting Steve committed for at least a little while, and that while he was away, she and Ben were going to move out. Not only did they move out, they moved from North Carolina to Oregon. They hopped on a bus across the country and they were gone. When Steve got out, he was entirely delusional. He claimed Jane and Ben abandoned him. His version of the story was incredibly warped and none of it sounded like him. One of his cats had gone missing, and he was totally fine with it, even though everyone knew how much he loved and babied those cats. Jane recently messaged me on Facebook, showing me one of his posts. It was insane. Here's an excerpt of what Steve said. On May 10th of this year, I hadn't slept for 2 days. Some asshole stole my car. I fell when practicing my fencing and broke my computer. Then I went to Mission Hospital to get the wounds in my right knee dressed, only to find some asshole using soap and water and saying, "That's it." I asked him, "That's it?" quizzically. I could have done that myself just as well. He pointed at me. "I don't like your tone. You are now involuntarily committed." I spent the next month with an infected wound in my knee, still no better than I could have done myself. I spent the next few hours trying to figure out why and where I was, only to be transferred to an institution, where I waited patiently for less than 4 hours before a law enforcement officer drove me to some Marine base. The police didn't know why they were even escorting me there. They were complaining about it the whole time. I was silent, observing and speculating, and it took me weeks to figure out where I was, to figure out what most of the medicine they put me on was. I even forgot my own name, because it wasn't my priority. They never listened to me, not even once. I am legally disabled for a very severe anxiety disorder. I have Medicare and Medicaid. Call my caseworker at the Social Security Administration. I have no history whatsoever of deserving to be in a place like this. Can I go home? Who wouldn't want to go home? There was obviously no real reason for my involuntary commitment, and no one listened to a man who by no fault of his own was there. That's the end of his passage. We were afraid. We're still afraid that he'll come after me. I'm still in the same area he is. I can't move away. He regularly comes out to my college to hang out with his friends. While I was home one day, he came to my house. I didn't have much choice, but I was able to have one of my friends, who's 6'5", come over to mediate. Steve was mostly okay, but he 100% believes every delusion he's spouted. He reacted poorly when he brought up Jane and Ben, which I'd been trying to avoid. For now, I'm on his good side, but I feel like I need a bodyguard. He still knows where I live. He knows my number. And he knows how to contact me and get to me. How long until he decides I'm not on his side?
I am a girl and was 15 years old when this happened. I live with my father and brother. My father was usually with his girlfriend at the weekends, and my brother was often with his friends, so I was often home alone. I'd been to a friend's house on Saturday night, so I was home late. Nobody was around as usual, and I was not tired yet, so I stayed in the living room. I picked up my phone and messaged a friend. That's when I saw some movement from the corner of my eye. When I looked, I saw that someone was standing at the back door and tried to open it. I'd locked it because I was home alone. It must have been a friend of my brother's, I thought. I walked to the back door and unlocked it. When I walked back into the living room, I asked him where my brother was and went back to the couch. When he didn't respond and sits next to me, I was very surprised. I saw my brother wasn't there and didn't know this man at all. Shit. What have I done? I was scared. Why did I open the door for him? When I looked through the window at the front of the house, I saw a group of drunken boys shouting and looking inside. The man who sat next to me was also drunk and started touching me. I asked him if he could leave and said that I didn't know him. He didn't react and tried to kiss me. I pushed him away, and he told me that he wanted to have sex with me. Wow. I was really angry now and scared. I yelled that he needed to leave my house. I got up and tried to pull him off the couch. At first it didn't work. When I finally got him off the couch, I pushed him towards the kitchen. I was glad he was drunk, because I was stronger than him, even though he was older and bigger than me. I pushed him through the kitchen towards the back door from where he came, and I don't remember exactly what he was saying, but I was too angry and pumped full of adrenaline. When we were standing in the back door, I opened it for him and yelled that he had to leave. Nothing happened, so I pulled him to the door. It was a real struggle. He'd grabbed the doorframe with his hand, and I tried to push him through, but he didn't let go. I kicked him, and he was finally outside, and I locked the door as soon as possible. I couldn't believe I was so stupid to open the back door. What if I hadn't gotten so angry and dragged him out of the house? Could I have been raped? Second story. I live in the Netherlands. When this happened, I was 16 years old. I have a scooter and often drive home at night because my friends live far away. In the Netherlands, you have bike paths where you sometimes have to drive on with scooters. These bike paths are usually next to the main road, with maybe a piece of grass in between. I drove home on my scooter at 3 AM, and I stood at a traffic light on the bike path. After the traffic light, you had an abandoned road without streetlights. On the other side of the traffic light, I saw 5 people walking. At first, they walked onto the side of the bike path, but when they saw me, they spread all over the path so I couldn't pass them if the light turned green. They were all wearing hoods and dark clothes, and when I looked again, I saw one person had something in his hand. It looked like a stick. My heart was in my throat, and there was no one around me except the people on the other side of the path. They can easily do something to me. What should I do? The traffic light can turn green at any moment, and I'm just a girl, and no one would help me if something happened. I have to avoid them. When the light turned green, I immediately drove at full speed towards the road where the cars would normally drive. They all looked after me as I drove by. What were they planning? What were they doing around that time on an abandoned road? Why did that guy have a stick in his hand, if it was a stick at all? I'm glad I didn't find out. Always be aware of your surroundings.
This was something my mother told me about a woman she used to work with. This is a messed up one for sure. Her name is Susie, and Susie was a psychopath. My mom on the first day working with her was told by Susie that if she knew my mom had ever hurt an animal, she would kill her without a second thought. Definite weirdo. A lot of her behavior in the mortuary was unnerving to say the least. My mom would continually come home and tell me about how comfortable she was working so closely with Susie. So unsurprisingly, after 2 years of it, she quit. We left from that part of California and moved up to a small town in British Columbia. 3 years or so after moving, my mom went down to visit friends in the area. She met with a woman who was both a friend and who she trained to do her job at the mortuary, and was very excited to share what happened to their ex-colleague, Susie. "You'll never guess what happened to Susie," she said. My mom was taken aback when she told her that quite recently, Susie had been cut off in traffic and followed a guy home, where she beat him with a tire iron. Sharon smiled and said, "Do you remember Susie had a brother?" My mom nodded. "Yeah, well, her brother got AIDS, and Susie thought that if he died of AIDS, she couldn't get the life insurance policy for his death, because that was one of the diseases that most insurance companies of that time weren't covering, because it was thought to be preventable by safe sex." She went on to say that Susie recruited her boyfriend, and they killed her brother, rolled him up in a carpet, doused it in gasoline, and set it on fire. My mom was shocked. Even for Susie, that seemed beyond the pale. Sharon added, "Poor Susie. Her boyfriend decided he'd do the same thing to her and get another insurance policy. So after they got him, he got her." Mom was shocked, but at the same time she thought of it like this. Like Jesus said, "Those who live by the sword, die by the sword."
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. And a huge thank you to Mr. X Dreams for helping me out with tonight's stories. Now don't forget, this is a collaboration, and we have even more stories over on Mr. X Dreams channel. So please, be sure to follow me over there now, and finish off part 2, which you'll find on screen and in the description. But for now, a few words from Mr. X before I see you there.
Greetings, friends. I'm Mr. X Dreams. I'd like to thank Mortis Media for having me over for this collab. If you like what you heard, come on over and subscribe to my channel. Be a part of the Dreamers. I have plenty of very interesting, thought-provoking, and creepy stories over on my channel. I hope to see you there soon. Until next time, my friends. Take care.